Instructions for the babysitter. I've only been babysitting for about 6 months now. It was an easy way to make money and it didn't require me to have any real, applicable skills. It was slow going at first, but a couple of months ago I hit the jackpot after a young couple from the rich part of my town asked me to look after their 2 kids one Friday night. They paid me $200 freaking to look after their extremely well-behaved children for 3 hours in a house 5 times the size of mine. It was awesome. The young couple must have also thought that I had done a good job because word spread quickly around the rich neighborhood about the nice, young lady who was willing to look over your children so you could go out for a night of drinking and fun. And when I say that this neighborhood is one of the richest in our state, I am not exaggerating. Most of the people living there are young couples who have come from a long line of wealthy families. Sometimes I'll babysit for a few of hours and make a couple $100. Other times the parents want me to stay the night while they go off and get a hotel room so that they could be away from their kids for a change. That is where I make the big bucks. A couple of days ago a husband and wife had texted me asking if I could stay the night at their mansion and watch their 7-year-old little girl for them. I happily agreed. If only I knew what I was in for. When the day finally came I drove my beat-up Jeep Wrangler to the edge of the rich neighborhood and made my way up this private driveway that I had never noticed before because the entrance was hidden back amongst the trees that surround the entire north side of town. I drove up this steep, winding driveway for what seemed like 10 minutes before I finally saw the house come into view. Out of all the houses I've babysat at, this was hands down the most gorgeous one I've ever seen. It was a huge Victorian-style mansion that was covered in dark brown bricks, making it blend perfectly into the woods surrounding it. I got out of my car and made my way up to the front porch where I knocked on this gigantic, wooden door. A few seconds later a beautiful woman in her mid-30s answered and introduced herself as Mrs. Collins. She called her husband down and shortly after an extremely handsome man also in his 30s came walking down the grand stairway holding an adorable little girl in his arms. The couple seemed very anxious to leave, and even though they were both gorgeous people I could tell that underneath all of their beauty they were both extremely tired and haggard from having to keep up with their 7-year-old. They were obviously very excited about having an entire night to themselves and couldn't wait to get out of there as fast as they could. Before Mr. and Mrs. Collins left, however, Mrs. Collins handed me several pieces of paper and told me that she had written down a couple of instructions for me to follow throughout the night. She stressed to me how important it was to follow her instructions and I assured her that I'd give them a look. I waved to the pretty young couple as they made their way down the driveway in their expensive Mercedes and then closed the door behind me. I gave the instructions a quick once-over before folding the papers and stuffing them into my back pocket. I'll look at them later, I told myself. How stupid I was to do that. Mr. and Mrs. Collins' daughter, Samantha, was a very nice, young girl who warmed up to me almost immediately, and we had spent the next few hours playing games and watching TV. After we finished our 5th episode of Teen Titans Go, I noticed that it was getting late and asked Samantha what her bedtime was. She shrugged, not really giving me an answer, which is when I remembered Mrs. Collins' instructions. I pulled out the folded pieces of paper and scanned through them very quickly when I saw the words Samantha needs to be in bed before 8 p.m. I checked the time to find that it was almost 7:45. Well, it looks like your bedtime is right now. I said, lift Samantha up off the couch so I could get her ready. She brushed her teeth and I tucked her into her California king-sized mattress. I told her good night and was leaving her room when she said something that stopped me in my tracks. Don't forget to lock my door before you leave, she said. I stopped walking and turned back around toward her confused. What do you mean don't forget to lock your door? I asked, why would I need to lock your door? What if you have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night? She looked at me innocently and shrugged her shoulders again. I don't know, but Mommy always locks my door before I go to sleep. She says she does it to protect me and herself. I don't remember what happens after I fall asleep, but Mommy says that I always try to leave my room at night, which is bad thing. I looked at her dumbfounded. I didn't know what to say. Mommy told me that she would leave instructions for you to follow and locking my door is one of them, she said. Okay Samantha, I'll lock your door. Good night sweetheart. I stammered. She gave me a big smile and rolled over in her bed. I closed her door and noticed that there was a latch drilled into the door frame that would allow someone to lock it from the outside. I closed the latch and then walked back downstairs so I could read the rest of Mrs. Collins' instructions. When I had first seen the pieces of paper, I was under the impression that they were just instructions that told me what shows Samantha is not allowed to watch, or how to operate the surround sound. After I started reading them, though, I realized that I was wrong. I was completely and utterly wrong. Hello, Annie. I'm so glad that you agreed to stay the night and babysit Samantha for us. She is such an angel, and I am sure that the both of you will get along very well. I know that our house might seem old and scary, but don't worry, because nothing bad will happen to you as long as you follow some simple instructions. Firstly, Samantha needs to be in bed in her room with the door locked before 8 p.m. Do not open up her bedroom door after 8 p.m. I repeat, do not open Samantha's bedroom door after 8 p.m. She will try to convince you to open the door in many different ways. She will cry, scream, and threaten you until you give in, but do not listen to her. She can't hurt you as long as the door is closed. Between 8:30 and 9:30 p.m. Make sure you remain in the living room with the lights turned on. Around this time of night you may hear scratching and growling coming from Samantha's room, or from other parts of the house. These noises are nothing to worry about as long as you stay in the living room. Watch some TV to pass the time. We have a lot of movies to choose from, winky face. After 9:30 do not venture into any dark areas of the house. I would recommend that you turn on as many lights as you can before 9:30 so that you don't accidentally trap yourself. You might begin to see things hiding in the dark areas of the house from time to time, and sometimes they will even try to talk to you. Just ignore them and they'll eventually ignore you as well. You might also happen to see a pair of yellow cat eyes looking at you through the darkness every once in a while. Do not stare at them for more than 30 seconds. At around 10 p.m. It might begin to sound like there are several people walking around in the basement downstairs. Do not worry, because as long as you stay out of the basement, they cannot get to you. I know it sounds unlikely, but around this time you will begin to feel an overwhelming urge to walk down into the basement. If this happens, go into the kitchen and drink a cold glass of milk. This usually helps. The urge will most likely pass after about 10 minutes. But if the urge is still there after 10 minutes and you don't think that you will be able to stop yourself from walking into the basement, then call either me or Mr. Collins and we'll tell you what to do. When 10:30 comes around, you will begin to hear something running back and forth in the hallway upstairs. Stay on the first floor of the house during this time. Don't worry about Samantha. As long as you locked her door beforehand, he won't be able to get to her. If you start to hear him making his way down the stairs, then lock yourself in the first floor bathroom with the lights on. He will knock on the bathroom door repeatedly and will try impersonating someone close to you like your mom or your dad in order to trick you into opening the bathroom door for him. He is really good at it. No matter what he says to you and no matter who he sounds like, do not open the door. He should go away after 5 minutes. Check under the door to make sure that he is no longer there before you open it. Now this next part is very important. You will be sleeping in our guest room upstairs for the night. Before you go to bed, make sure that you leave a plate outside your bedroom door with a piece of raw steak on it. You can find the raw steak in our refrigerator. And leave a glass of milk next to the plate as well. On a piece of paper, write the words "Park Aunt Mihi" in red ink and leave it on the plate with the raw meat. Also, at some point during the night you might wake up and notice that there is something standing in the corner of your room. Please refrain from looking at the figure as much as you can. I'd recommend wearing earbuds so that you won't hear it muttering to itself. And that's about it. There are also a few other general rules that you should follow throughout the night just to make sure that nothing bad happens. Rule 1. If the house phone rings at any point during the night, don't answer it no matter how long or how loud it might ring. Mr. Collins and I will call your cell phone if we need to talk with you. Rule 2. If you feel something tap you on the shoulder at any point during the night, don't turn around and wait at least 30 seconds before moving again. Rule 3. Don't eat meat after 8 o'clock. They might see it as a threat and will most likely attack you. Thanks again, Annie. If you have any trouble or questions, feel free to call me or my husband at any point during the night. If you do call us and a man with a very deep voice answers the phone, hang up immediately and try calling us again. P.S. Throughout the night you might hear a dog whimpering from somewhere off inside the house. We don't have a dog, so don't go looking for it. I hadn't realized what I had gotten myself into. It is currently 8:31 p.m. As I am writing this, and the growling noises just started. It sounds like they're coming from every room in the fucking house. I thought that Samantha's screams from a couple minutes ago were going to be the worst part, but now I can hear her muffled growls from upstairs, and I can assure you that this is worse. This is so much worse. I work as a waitress at a diner, and I think one of our regulars might be the devil. I work at a rest stop diner in a town people pass through as quick as they can on their way to something, or someone, better. It's called Lucky's, which is a little ironic because if you've ended up here you're anything but. If you stay too long the dust settles. Working at Lucky's you never see the same license plates twice, or faces for that matter. I've lost count of the amount of times the answer to my "where you heading?" has been anywhere but back. The lights flicker more often than not, and the jukebox sometimes spits out songs that aren't on the index cards, but the coffee's hot, and most people who try them say the pancakes are the best they'll ever have, and I'm inclined to agree. The embroidered name tag on my uniform reads Isabella, but that ain't even close to my real name. It was my mom's. Lucky's has been here a long time. I wear it because I like hearing her name said by other people. It's like she's still here, still coming up in conversation. Like she might walk through the door any second and isn't buried in the cemetery just past the strip club. Lucky's is also always open. Always. Working long shifts serving drifters and truckers and runaways. Those who have become impermanent out on the highways, you get to know how to read people pretty quick. When you move around that much, always on the road, you leave parts of yourself behind sometimes, lost between the miles. Sometimes, people are just driving because there's nothing else left to do. Working at Lucky's I've seen all sorts of lost things. I once saw a man hit a deer with his truck and pull over to bury it in the red dirt, digging as the sun went down. Tears a steady flow down his face as he fought the ground to cover up what he had done. I once had a man I recognized from the news leave me a blood-stained $20 as a tip, sad-eyed in a denim jacket that barely hid the gun taped to his ribs. I once saw a one-armed girl no more than 16 stand up on the roof of her car and sing, until a coyote came and sat in front of the hood, howling along. I once saw two women fistfight in the parking lot in the night outside, until one was spitting blood and teeth and then they kissed in the blue lights of the police car that happened to pass them by. Faces lit up red and shining. I've seen the highway on fire, lines of flames between tires as the asphalt set itself alight in the heat. I've seen roadside baptisms, preacher pulled up with a van and a kiddie pool. I've seen things walking out in the desert just beyond reach of the neon sign for the motel that don't look quite like people, shifting out in the blue night. I met a woman who showed me a photograph of the place she was buried. I often meet people who you talk with a while until their faces start to flicker, can't quite hold up the pretense that long. I've met people who have to be invited inside before they can cross the threshold. I've met some lovely members of a sacrificial cult who tipped well and were oh so polite, even when they asked me if I'd consider letting them harvest me. But this is a story about, well, you read the title. It was a Friday and I was working a night shift. I prefer nights, because when I drive home I can pretend for a while that I'm going to follow the tail lights of the car in front until I leave everything in my rearview mirror, until it gets light and the desert changes to ocean. Like if I rolled my windows all the way down I'd taste salt on the air. That, and I'm one of the only waitresses, shall we say, qualified to deal with the night customers. Besides, tips are always better when the moon is out. We only have 3 true regulars in Lucky's, and only 2 had showed so far. Rosemarie, our first and most frequent regular, was sat by the window in her brown fur coat, always drawn about her shoulders come rain or shine. Not that it ever rained here. Her hair was long and white down her back, like the moon through a glass. She waved over to me, gracing me with a wink that made her crow's feet deepen, all the more beautiful for it. Rosemarie liked whiskey in her tea. Sometimes, she fed cake crumbs to the voodoo dolls she carried in her pockets. She was also a chronic insomniac and liked the company of Lucky's when sleep was hiding from her. She continued to shuffle through the deck of cards she had already set up on the tabletop. I watched her thumbs flipping over 2 jokers. Rosemarie liked to divine the future, when she had the time. She used a frayed pack of hotel playing cards, and if she was in a good mood she'd read your coffee grounds. I didn't ask her too much, because those coffee grounds had a startling way of coming true. Table 6 was empty, and spotless as usual. It was the only table without a salt shaker, and the only one I never placed cutlery on. Only one person ever sat there. Our second regular, Jones, was sat in his usual booth, dregs of his black coffee held tight between his hands, badge resting on the table. He had his eyes closed, head bent down like he was repenting, steam curling off the lip of the mug and wrapping round his fingers. Jones was my favorite of our customers, not that I'd ever tell him. I walked past the booth and slid a bowl of sugar packets along the tabletop until it hit the mug with a soft clink. He jumped, reaching for his holster out of habit, until his eyes focused and he saw me. He smiled, embarrassed, and it changed his face, dragging him back to life. When he smiled, it was like a storm in a drought, made you want to stand and watch, and maybe stay out in it just a while longer. I wanted to put my hands over his where they had resumed their place on the mug, to feel the second-hand heat through his palms. Sometimes I can sense the sad in people just by the feel of their skin. They carry it around with them, bone deep, trying to hide it from the world. But sometimes you can lift it from them for a minute or two, if you have enough kindness spare. It doesn't take much, most times. Jones was too young to be that sad. And yet, tired today? I gestured with the coffee pot to his half-empty cup. Everyone knew about the little girl he'd pulled from the dumpsters outside the swimming pool last week. She was the fifth one missing in 3 months. I could tell from the shadows like purple thumbprints beneath his eyes he'd been dreaming about her. She'd been found without her shoes on. He'd carried her to the ambulance in her socks, pink with little daisies on M, small in his arms like she was asleep. Lou the fry cook had cried when I'd told him that the other day. I really liked Lou. He was almost too big to fit through the service door, and had a tattoo of his dog just below the one of the angel of death on his shoulder. Lou sheds a tear for most things. The dead raccoons we're always finding by the back door with their hands missing. Whenever there's a new missing poster plastered over the cracked glass of the phone booth in the parking lot. Every time he hears "I will forever hate roses" when it decides to pop up on the jukebox. Big guy, bigger heart. Always tired, Jones said as I poured. Another girl had gone missing yesterday. As I poured, I made sure to brush his thumb where it rested on the cup handle with the inside of my wrist, lifting out that sadness as far as I could. He smiled up at me, shy, and I smiled back before I could stop myself. I walked on to the next booth, 2 truckers with faces that had seen too much sun. One was showing the other the photos of his new baby in his wallet. He had tobacco-stained teeth, a scab on his cheek and wind-chapped lips, and his smile was the most beautiful damn thing as he talked about his kid, lit up like Christmas morning. He showed me too as I refilled his coffee, and I stayed and talked to them a while. The other trucker, with gold-backed teeth, told me how he'd used to drive pigs, but couldn't handle the guilt when he handed them over to the slaughterhouse. Said he'd look right into their pink faces through the slats and their eyes looked right back, bright and pleading like they knew what he'd done. Said he still dreamt about them. Now he drove freezers of seafood, specialty deliveries for fancy hotels. He'd never seen the ocean. Lou slammed the bell from the depths of the kitchen and I got back to work, taking orders from a woman with a Labrador who ordered hot dogs for them both, and 3 teenage boys in their blood-stained varsity jackets in the corner, who had $10 between them and asked for as many waffles as they could get. They often came in on full moons, leaving their bikes chained up in the parking lot. They were always hunting something, with their baseball bats, backpacks filled with bullets and their daddy's guns, but they were nice kids so I always gave them extra scoops of ice cream. Besides, I knew they needed the energy, because when they were hunting they had to run fast. Real fast. There used to be 4 of them. I cleared the table from the 2 women at the next booth on my way back. They looked to be twins, both dressed in long silk skirts and hiking boots, red hair piled up messy on top of their heads. Neither acknowledged me, not out of rudeness but because they were too preoccupied, packing up their bags, overspilling with maps and notebooks. I spied a roll of duct tape and a bottle of vodka in there too, along with some stakes and crucifixes. They were deep in conversation, waving their hands, and I caught a little of it as I stacked their empty glasses, lipsticked round the rims. I know where I buried him, Sylvia dash, you don't know Jack's hit. We dug for hours, and dash. My mom always taught me eavesdropping was rude, so I left them to it and headed into the kitchen. But I got the sense that wherever they had left, whoever he was, he certainly wasn't there no more. I felt like telling them, but like my mom said, it's not polite to listen to other people's conversations. You never know what you'll wish you hadn't heard. Lou was dancing to the radio, swaying his hips to Sugar Hill as Dolly sang down the wires. He waved at me with the spatula he was using as a microphone. Carlos handed me a plate of pancakes. Carlos had worked here so long he'd known my mom, and was the only one who knew my real name. He sometimes came with me on the weekends to change the flowers on her grave. He always brought her desert flowers, growing from the same earth she was. Carlos was also the only one who knew the recipe for the Lucky's pancakes, and the only one that could cook them right. On days when he wasn't working, we had no pancakes. Simple as. That was just the way it went. I'd learned that the hard way, but that's another story. Along with the pancakes came a warning. He's back. He gestured through the doors. Table 6. Our final regular had showed. It had been a while since he'd been around. I hadn't even seen him come in, but that wasn't unusual. He moved in mysterious ways. I raised an eyebrow. Shit. Carlos raised one back. Oh shit. He tossed me the salt with a grimace, and I filled the pockets of my apron. Lou banged around in one of the staff lockers for a moment, until he emerged triumphant, waving a Bible that had definitely seen better days. He placed it on the counter next to the syrup jugs and flipped to a random page. We leant over his huge shoulders to read what it said. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. Lou shrugged and patted me on the shoulder. I don't get paid enough for this shit. I took the pancakes to table 6, which had been empty the last time I'd looked. It was now very much occupied. The man sat at table 6 was smiling as I walked over. If you could call it a smile. It was more like rictus, lips straining deep red at the corners of his face. His eyes kept darting from side to side, too fast to count, like his pupils couldn't make up their mind where they should be. His hands shook as I got closer, hovering like flies on a carcass. I tried to lean as far away from him as I could as I placed the plate on the tabletop, but as I pulled my hands away he darted his neck out fast, whipping his head up and tilting his face towards me. He sniffed in, hard, eyelids fluttering. He giggled, shrill like it was stuck on the roof of his mouth. I recoiled, trying to hide the urge I had to run back to the kitchen. There's something about hearing a grown man giggle that makes the skin crawl. Can I get you anything? I asked, faking bright. I'd take your name. He gripped one of the pancakes in his fist, turning it to mush. I tapped the name tag on my uniform. He shook his head, grinning, shoulders almost vibrating with this strange fluid roll as his smile slipped for a second, front teeth jutting suddenly, tongue sharply poking out. Filth was caked under his nails, red like the dirt on the sides of the road. Then he was smiling again, swaying slowly from side to side, feral, in his hunting jacket. His hair hung in greasy strings around his ears, like blonde rat tails, and they swung with him, back and forth. Isabella, Isabella, Isabella. It don't suit. He suddenly slammed his hand up to his face, shoveling the crushed pancake into the gaping hole of his wide mouth. I jerked back, the movement was so sudden. I shoved my hands into my apron, reaching for the salt, and his eyes narrowed. There's no need for that, came a voice from behind me. It rolled across my shoulders, deep to the bone. Mr. Prince. I turned to face our third regular, relief mixing with fear in a swirling pit in my chest. Kinda like that feeling you get at a fairground in midsummer, when you've been on a carousel too long, and part of you knows you need to get off, but the other part doesn't want to leave because you know as soon as you stand still you're gonna be sick. Mr. Prince had that effect on people. Mr. Prince was dressed, as always, in his black pinstripe. His Stetson was darker than the night outside, and his boots shone like they were wet. If you didn't notice the upside-down crucifixes embroidered daintily onto his custom lapels, you'd think he was just a man with money, maybe mixed up in something a little shady, like oil or pharmaceuticals. He was handsome by the way of his jaw, with his bone-white smile, but his black sunglasses were balanced on the bridge of his nose, silver-rimmed and gleaming, hiding his eyes as usual. When he spoke it was a drawl, dragged up from the depths of the South. I'm sorry for my acquaintance. He's a little. Mr. Prince glanced at the man sat at table 6 as he panted with his tongue hung out, like a dog. Overexcited. Mr. Prince sat down and the lights above the booth flickered. He tilted his hat back on his head and the jukebox coughed and skipped. And suddenly Robert Johnson was on and singing about that damn crossroad again. Mr. Prince popped a Marlboro Red between his teeth and pushed the window open a sliver with the knuckles of his left hand. The silver pentagram ring on his wedding finger clacked against the glass. Mr. Prince smiled, the way snakes do when they're watching you from the grass on their bellies. The cigarette was now smoking between his teeth, although he hadn't moved. Besides, Leroy ain't the type for salt. He's just a man. He looked him up and down and his top lip curled. Barely. He turned to Leroy. I see you started on my pancakes. But what's the point of good food if it ain't for sharing? Leroy giggled that strange high sound that made me want to run, and shook a little. Everything about Leroy made me nervous, fight or flight getting ready to flood my system. Mr. Prince handed Leroy a menu. Order whatever you want. He leant forward and the lights flickered. Leroy ordered for cheeseburgers and glass of milk. Well, if that's all. I managed. I could feel Leroy's eyes clinging to my back as I left. Rosemarie waved me over before I could get back to the safety of the kitchen. I wouldn't worry about him, darlin'. She crossed herself and tapped the card on top of the pile. The Jack of Spades. It had its eyes scratched out. But not by Rosemarie. It looked like it had been printed that way for years. We won't be seeing him again. She wasn't talking about Mr. Prince. She cupped my cheek and I leant into it, her hand rough with age, but warm. I could tell she thought I looked tired. She paid for her tea and toast, and walked out into the warm night waiting outside the doors. I finally made it back into the kitchen and was immediately attacked. Cold water doused me in the face and I threw up my arms on instinct, trying to protect my hair. Lou aggressively squirted me in the face with the spray bottle we also kept in the staff locker, the kind you use for tending houseplants. Ours was filled with holy water. Lou. Jesus fucking Christ, get off I sputtered, and he sprayed me again. I spat holy water out, dripping down the front of my dress and wiped it from my eyes, makeup running a little. I grabbed the bottle from his hands. I think I'm good. I wasn't really mad though, better safe than sorry, especially when it comes to possession. Sorry. Just checkin'. Lou sheepishly handed me a dish towel. Already did me en Carlos. He looked down at his shoes, awkward. He was a foot taller than me and a decade older, and I hid my smile because he was twisting the toe of his boot back and forth like a little kid been kept after class. Carlos kept his eyes firmly fixed on his hands as he started flipping patties, but I could sense him holding back a laugh, desperately clenching his teeth. I narrowed my eyes and aimed the spray bottle at him. Maybe you need some more, I threatened. Lou snorted and then Carlos was laughing and I was too, and that heavy feeling that had hovered over us since Mr. Prince had walked and lifted. Sometimes when things get too dark, all you can do is laugh. Mom always said that when shit gets rough, you can either choose to laugh or cry. I never saw my mother cry. It was coming up on 3 in the morning as I took the burgers back to table 6. Leroy visibly drooled and clapped his hands as I walked over. I put the plate in front of him as quick as I could, but as I pulled back, his head darted forward and he licked the inside of my wrist. His tongue was long and wet against my pulse. I recoiled like I'd been bitten and he laughed, shrill and manic. You taste better than they will, he said, grinning and gesturing to the burgers. Mr. Prince watched this unfold, calm and unreadable like the sky before summer lighting burns down a tree. I frantically wiped my arm on my apron, but I could still feel that tongue on my skin as if I'd left my hand in his mouth. I fought off the tears that suddenly burned at the corners of my eyes, because something told me Leroy would enjoy them just a little too much. I shuddered and cleared Mr. Prince's plate. Tell Carlos the pancakes were good as hell, he said, from behind his sunglasses. Then he chuckled, low and raspy, as if something he'd said was funny. He popped another Marlboro between his teeth and it started to glow, as Leroy shoveled meat down his throat. I tried not to gag as I watched it clog beneath his long nails. I walked by Jones on my way back. He waved me over, eyes creased with worry. He ran a hand over his face, as if he was trying to wipe all the bad things away. Is he both there in you? He gestured over to Leroy, who was rocking back and forth drinking his milk. Jones suddenly looked so tired, uniform creased as his face, looking 50 instead of his 22. Nothing I can't handle. I shook my head and thought about Rosemarie. We won't be seeing him again. It felt like hours waiting for Leroy to finish. I took the order of a man with a butterfly tattooed on his neck, and some truckers pouring Jim Beam into their coffee. They asked me for an extra cup, which they placed at the empty seat on their table, for absent friends, they said. I cleaned down the countertop, restocked the sugar packets, and took out the trash, ignoring the man in the rabbit mask that often waits out by the dumpsters. As long as you don't look at him, he doesn't bother you. I refilled coffee cups, and took the orders of the large group of biker girls that came in, leather-clad and road-weary. At 3:03 a.m., Mr. Prince stood. Leroy had licked his plate clean and was sitting still, staring up at him with his teeth bared in a smile, hands gripping the tabletop so hard his knuckles were going white as milk. Mr. Prince handed me a roll of bills wrapped in black plastic that I knew better than to count. He tipped his hat. "See, Leroy. We all gotta pay eventually," he said. He leaned in and spoke softly. "For I will not acquit the wicked," he smiled. He held out his hand to Leroy, palm flat, waiting. Leroy's hands shook as he reached into his hunting jacket and pulled out a pair of shoes. A child's shoes, small enough that both could fit in one hand. Little pink sneakers, dirty, with brown stains on the toes that I knew could only be one thing. Mr. Prince considered them a moment, under the lights, and shook his head. He seemed like he was sorry, before he handed them to me. "For your man over there. Tell him to dig deeper where they looked last." He nodded to Jones, who was watching us, his badge gripped in his hand. But Jones knew better than to come over. "Mr. Prince turned to Leroy and grinned around his cigarette. "We've got a ways to go, the road we're taking. They say it's paved with good intentions." He chuckled, and I felt sick to my stomach. He took Leroy's hand, like a child, and they walked out into the night, warm and waiting. The doors swung shut behind them, even though nobody had touched them. The jukebox sputtered, and Chris Ray was on, singing about that road again. I placed the shoes on the table by Jones' empty coffee cup, and passed on the message. He sat still for a long time after, just watching them on the tabletop, trying not to cry or scream or punch a hole in the plaster. All I could do was refill his coffee, because when someone is trying to hold themselves together like that, there's nothing left to say. My shift ended, and I drove myself home, following the taillights in front of me. I knew when I woke up it would be dark, and it would be time for my next shift, but for now, I just drove, dreaming about the ocean and watching the sun come up, like it always does, despite everything.